The headlights cut through the rain like two pale fingers reaching into darkness, and Thomas Mercer almost didn't see her in time. The figure stumbled into the road, arms waving desperately, dress torn and muddied, face streaked with something that could have been blood or just the storm's merciless assault. He slammed the brakes on his ancient pickup, the tires hydroplaning for a heart-stopping second before the truck shuddered to a halt 15 feet from where she stood, swaying like wheat in high wind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas sat frozen behind the wheel, engine idling rough like it always did when the rain was heavy. Through the windshield's rhythmic sweep of wipers, he could see her more clearly now. Young woman, maybe 30, professional clothes beneath the mud and damage, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't just car trouble. This was terror. He reached for the door handle, then hesitated. 23 years of farming the same 300 acres in rural Nebraska had taught him caution. The Mercer land sat 12 miles from the nearest town, connected to civilization by a single county road that barely deserved the name. Nobody ended up out here by accident, especially not on a night like this when the storm had been raging for hours, turning every field into a lake and every ditch into a river. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, rough as sandpaper but warm as summer sun. A man's character isn't measured by what he does when the world's watching, Tommy. It's what he does when nobody would ever know. Thomas pushed open the door and stepped into the downpour. "Please," the woman gasped the moment he was close enough to hear over the rain. "Please, you have to help me, they're coming." Up close, he could see the damage more clearly. Scratches ran down her arms, deep enough to have bled but already starting to clot. Her expensive heels were gone, feet bare and bleeding on the asphalt. But it was her eyes that struck him most. Intelligent eyes, calculating even through the fear, taking in everything about him in the space of seconds. This was someone used to reading people, used to making split-second assessments that mattered. "Who's coming?" Thomas asked, already guiding her toward the passenger side of his truck. Whatever her answer was going to be, he wasn't leaving her here to find out. "I can't," she started, then stumbled. Thomas caught her, feeling how she trembled despite the humid summer air. "I can't tell you. The less you know, the safer you are. Just somewhere off the road. Somewhere they won't look." Every instinct Thomas had developed over 2 decades of barely surviving in an economy that had forgotten farmers like him screamed that this was trouble. The kind of trouble that found you even when you did everything right, even when you kept your head down and minded your business. But he was already putting the truck in gear, already turning down the narrow dirt path that led to his property. The Mercer farmhouse appeared through the rain like a ghost from a better time. 2 stories of weathered white paint and hope that had slowly faded over the years, much like the farm itself. Thomas could remember when the place had buzzed with life, his grandfather striding through fields of golden wheat, his father maintaining equipment that actually worked, visiting neighbors who hadn't sold out yet. Now it stood alone, an island in a sea of corporate-owned acreage that stretched to every horizon. He pulled the truck up to the barn instead of the house, some instinct telling him that visibility from the road mattered tonight. The barn door groaned in protest as he shouldered it open, years of rust and neglect making everything harder than it should be. Inside, the smell hit him like it always did. Old hay, machine oil, and the ghost of prosperity past. "You can stay here tonight," Thomas said, grabbing an old blanket from his emergency kit and handing it to her. "I've got a first aid kit in the house. Let me get it and—" "No." Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "No lights in the house, no calls, no one can know I'm here." She released him, seeming to realize how that sounded. "I know how this looks. I know you have every reason to think I'm crazy or dangerous or both, but I'm asking you to trust me for one night, just until morning." Thomas studied her in the barn's dim light. Her accent was educated, East Coast maybe, with the kind of polish that came from schools and opportunities that people like him never saw. Whatever had brought her to this moment, it was a long way from home. "I'm going to get that first aid kit," he said finally. You don't have to tell me anything, but those cuts need cleaning before they get infected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He returned 10 minutes later with the kit, a thermos of coffee, and one of his grandmother's old dresses. The woman had moved deeper into the barn, positioning herself where she could see both the main door and the side entrance. Even exhausted and injured, she was thinking tactically. Thomas had seen enough military veterans at the feed store in town to recognize the pattern. As he helped her clean the wounds on her arms, his mind wandered to the stack of past due notices sitting on his kitchen table. The bank's final warning about the equipment loan. The letter from Hartwell Agricultural Group offering to buy him out. The third such letter this month, each one worded a little more aggressively than the last. Tomorrow morning, he was supposed to drive into town and sign the papers that would end for generations of Mercers working this land. His grandfather would have fought. His father had fought, right up until the heart attack took him 5 years ago at 58, worn down by stress and debt and watching everything he'd built slowly crumble. Thomas had thought he'd fight too. But at 45, with nothing but broken equipment and exhausted soil to show for 2 decades of grinding work, he'd finally accepted what everyone had been telling him for years. The age of the family farm was over. "Thank you," the woman said quietly, breaking his thoughts. She'd changed into the dress and looked almost normal now, if you ignored the haunted look in her eyes. I know you didn't ask for any of this." "Nobody asks for most things that matter," Thomas said, echoing his grandfather again. "They just happen, and you deal with them." They sat in silence for a while, the rain drumming on the barn's tin roof like distant artillery. Thomas found himself studying the old John Deere tractor that had been his father's pride, now just an expensive lawn ornament since the transmission died. Beside it sat the combine they'd had to mortgage the land to buy, promising that it would change everything, make them competitive again. It had worked for 3 years before a bearing failure and a repair cost that might as well have been $1 million. "Can I ask you something?" the woman said suddenly. "This land, how long has your family worked it?" "Since 1889, Thomas answered automatically. "My great-great-grandfather won it in the land lottery, broke his back turning prairie into farmland. Every generation since has added to it, or at least tried to hold on to what we had." He paused. "Tomorrow I'm signing it over to a corporation, so I guess I'll be the last Mercer who can say that." Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or recognition. "You're selling? Tomorrow?" "What's left of it, yeah. The bank's taking most of it anyway. Hartwell's just buying the remainder and assuming the debt." He didn't know why he was telling her this. Maybe because come morning, it wouldn't be a secret anymore. Maybe because saying it out loud to a stranger made it feel less like failure. They'll probably bulldoze the house, turn it all into another section of industrial farmland, 5,000 acres of corn and soybeans, managed by computers and seasonal workers who don't even live here. The woman stood abruptly, moving to the barn door to peer out into the rain-soaked darkness. "Hartwell Agricultural Group," she said, not quite a question. "They've been buying up land in this county for months, haven't they?" "Most of the county," Thomas confirmed. "We're one of the last holdouts. Well, were." He heard the bitterness in his own voice and tried to soften it. "It's not personal. It's just economics. They can farm more efficiently at scale. The small operations like mine, we can't compete anymore." "Can't or aren't allowed to," the woman turned back to face him, and Thomas saw something new in her expression. Anger, carefully controlled but burning underneath. "Never mind. That's not... I shouldn't have said that." Before Thomas could respond, headlights swept across the barn walls. A vehicle was coming down his access road, moving slowly, searching. The woman went completely still, every muscle tensed. "Is there another way out?" she whispered. Thomas nodded toward the back of the barn, where a crawl space led to the old root cellar. His grandfather had built it during the Cold War, convinced that nuclear apocalypse was always one political crisis away. "Through there. The cellar has an exit that comes up in the tree line by the creek, but..." She was already moving. At the crawlspace entrance, she paused and looked back at him. "If they ask about me, tell them the truth. You saw someone on the road, but you kept driving because of the storm. Don't lie for me. I'm not worth the risk." Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness like she'd never been there. The vehicle pulled up outside, and Thomas recognized the sound of the engine, one of Hartwell's expensive SUVs, the kind their land acquisition specialists drove. He stepped out of the barn with his hands visible, an old habit from dealing with nervous corporate types who didn't understand rural life. Two men climbed out, both wearing rain jackets that probably cost more than Thomas's entire wardrobe. The one in front held up a badge of some kind, though Thomas couldn't make out the details in the darkness. "Mr. Mercer, sorry to disturb you at this hour. We're looking for someone who might have come through this area tonight. Woman, about 5'6", dark hair, probably disoriented or injured. You seen anyone like that?" Thomas kept his face neutral. "Haven't seen anybody. Been in the barn checking on equipment." Not quite a lie, but not quite the truth either. Storm's pretty bad to be out looking for someone. She in some kind of trouble? The two men exchanged a glance. "Just someone who needs medical attention," the second one said smoothly. "Nothing to worry about. Mind if we take a quick look around?" Every instinct told Thomas to refuse, to tell them to come back with a warrant. But these were probably going to be his bosses come tomorrow morning. Besides, the woman was long gone by now, headed to wherever that root cellar exit led. "Sure," he said. "Not much to see, but help yourselves." They spent 10 minutes searching the barn and the area around it, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Thomas watched them work, noting how thoroughly they checked every possible hiding spot. These weren't just guys looking for a lost hiker. They were professionals. Finally, they gave up. "Appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Mercer," the first one said, handing Thomas a business card. "If you do see anything unusual, give us a call. It's important we find her quickly, for her own safety." Thomas pocketed the card, without looking at it. "I'll do that." He watched their taillights disappear back down the access road, then waited another 30 minutes before finally heading to the house. Every light stayed off, just like she'd asked. He sat in his kitchen in the darkness, listening to the rain and wondering what the hell he'd just gotten himself into. The business card sat on the table in front of him. He turned on his phone's flashlight long enough to read it. Gerald Price, Senior Land Acquisition Specialist, Hartwell Agricultural Group. No mention of law enforcement or medical emergencies, just a company that wanted to buy his land. Thomas Mercer had gone to bed that night thinking he understood his situation. He was a failed farmer signing away his family's legacy because he'd run out of options. It was sad, it was unfair, but it was simple. By sunrise, he'd learned that nothing about his situation was simple, and the woman he'd helped wasn't stranded at all. She was hiding from something far bigger than either of them had imagined, and whatever it was buried right here, somewhere beneath the Mercer family land. Thomas didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table watching the darkness gradually surrender to gray dawn, the business card turning over and over between his calloused fingers. Gerald Price. The name meant nothing to him yesterday. Now it felt like a key to a door he hadn't known existed. At 5:30, he walked out to where the root cellar's hidden exit opened near the creek. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the world dripping and fresh. Footprints led away from the exit, heading east through the tree line toward the old Henderson property. Except there was no Henderson property anymore. Hartwell had bought it 6 months ago, along with the Morrison place and the Jang farmstead. 3 generations of neighboring families, gone in the span of a year. The footprints disappeared into tall grass, and Thomas stood there wondering if he'd dreamed the whole thing. Then he saw it. A scrap of fabric caught on a branch, dark blue material that matched the dress she'd been wearing. She'd been real. The question was what she'd been running from, and why men from Hartwell had been so determined to find her. Back at the house, Thomas made coffee and pulled out the folder he'd been avoiding for weeks. The sale document sat inside, pristine and official, each page marked with colored tabs showing where he needed to sign. 9 signatures, and the Mercer family's 135-year legacy would become a footnote in some corporate quarterly report. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Mr. Mercer?" A woman's voice, professional and controlled. This is Rebecca Chen from Hartwell Agricultural Group. I'm calling to confirm our appointment this morning at 9. We're looking forward to finalizing the transaction. Thomas glanced at the clock. 3.5 hours. Yeah, I'll be there. Excellent. And Mr. Mercer, Mr. Price, mentioned he stopped by your property last night. I hope everything was satisfactory? The way she said it made Thomas's jaw tighten. Not a question, but a test. Just looking for someone. I couldn't help them. Of course. A pause that lasted one beat too long. We'll see you at 9. The line went dead before Thomas could respond. He spent the next 2 hours doing what he'd done every morning for 23 years, walking his land. The eastern 40 acres where his grandfather had grown wheat so golden it looked like captured sunlight. The southern fields where his father had tried experimental crop rotations, convinced they could make the farm sustainable again. The northwest corner where the original homestead cabin had stood until fire took it in 1924, leaving only a stone foundation that grass had long since reclaimed. Every step felt like goodbye. The sun was fully up now, burning off the last of the storm's moisture, turning the world into something clean and new. Thomas found himself at the property's highest point, a gentle rise that gave him a view of all 300 acres. From here, he could see where Hartwell's industrial operation had swallowed the neighboring properties. Massive grain silos rose like tombstones on the horizon. Irrigation systems that cost more than his entire farm stretched across what used to be the Morrison family's organic vegetable operation. Even the houses were gone, bulldozed to make room for equipment storage. That would be his land in 6 months, every fence line erased, every memory plowed under. His phone buzzed again. This time, a text from an unknown number. Don't sign anything. Check your grandfather's survey maps from 1967. Southwest corner, section markers 14 to 17. Trust me. E. Thomas stared at the message. E, the woman from last night? How did she have his number? The survey maps. Thomas hadn't looked at those in years. They were stored in the barn, part of the massive collection of documents his grandfather had kept. A man who'd saved every receipt, every record, every piece of paper that touched the farm. His father used to joke that Grandpa could tell you what the rainfall was on any given day in 1952, and probably what he'd had for breakfast that morning, too. Thomas headed back to the barn, his mind churning. Section markers 1417 in the southwest corner. That was near the old Henderson boundary line, the lowest part of his property where water collected after heavy rains. Nothing particularly interesting about it that he could remember. The survey maps were exactly where he remembered, filed in a metal cabinet that had somehow survived decades of barn dust and humidity. Thomas spread the 1967 map across an old workbench, tracing the property lines with his finger. The southwest corner looked normal enough. Field notations, elevation markers, the usual survey information. Then he saw it. A small notation in his grandfather's handwriting, so faint he almost missed it. Geological anomaly. Bore sample 7-14-67, depth 35 feet, sealed per agreement. Per agreement. Agreement with whom? Thomas pulled out more maps going back further. 1963, 1959, 1955. The same corner, the same notation, growing more detailed the further back he went. In 1952, his grandfather had written an entire paragraph in the margin. Henderson and Morrison confirmed same findings on their properties. Deposits extend across all 3 sections. Committee agreed. Seal all bore holes. No further exploration. Some things best left buried. Future generations will know what to do when the time comes. Thomas's hands had started shaking. Deposits. What kind of deposits? He was still staring at the maps when he heard vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles. Thomas stepped out of the barn and felt his stomach drop. 3 SUVs, all Hartwell logos. It wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. Gerald Price climbed out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 men who moved like security professionals. Behind them came Rebecca Chen, immaculate in a business suit despite the rural setting, and another man Thomas didn't recognize, older, with the kind of face that had made hard decisions and never looked back. "Mr. Mercer," Price called out, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Hope you don't mind us coming a bit early. Mr. Hartwell himself wanted to be here for the closing." The older man stepped forward, extending a hand. "David Hartwell. I don't usually attend these personally, but your property, well, it's special. I'm sure you understand. Thomas shook the offered hand, feeling like he'd just made a deal with something predatory. The appointment was for 9, in town. Change of plans, Hartwell said smoothly. We thought it would be more meaningful to sign here, on the land itself. Honor the legacy, you know. Your grandfather was a remarkable man. Did you know I met him once? 1989, County Fair. He was judging the wheat competition. Something about the way Hartwell said it made Thomas's skin crawl. This man knew things, had known his grandfather, had probably been circling this property for years, waiting. The woman you were looking for last night, Thomas said, changing the subject. You find her? Price's expression flickered. That's not really your concern, Mr. Mercer. It is if you were on my property at midnight looking for her, unless that badge you flashed was fake. The badge was real enough, Hartwell interjected, his voice carrying a warning, as was our concern for a confused woman who wandered away from a medical transport. But that situation has been resolved. Now, shall we handle our business? Rebecca Chen had already opened a briefcase, pulling out the same documents Thomas had been staring at all morning. She laid them out on the hood of one of the SUVs with practiced efficiency. Everything's in order, 9 signatures, and we can have the first payment transferred to your account within the hour. You'll be debt-free, Mr. Mercer. That must feel good. After all these years. It should have felt good. That was the hell of it. Thomas had been drowning in debt for so long that freedom should have tasted sweet. Instead, it tasted like ash. Tell me something, Thomas said, not moving toward the documents. That southwest corner of my property. What's so special about it? The silence that followed was profound. Hartwell's expression never changed, but something shifted behind his eyes. It's just land, Mr. Mercer. Nothing special about any particular corner. Then why did my grandfather seal boreholes there in 1967? And why did the neighboring families do the same thing? Price moved slightly, positioning himself between Thomas and the tree line. A subtle thing, but Thomas noticed these people had been soldiers or cops or something similar before they became corporate land agents. Your grandfather was an eccentric man, Hartwell said, his voice still calm but harder now. He had theories about water rights and mineral deposits that never panned out. That's part of why your family struggled financially for so long, chasing fantasies instead of focusing on practical farming. My grandfather was a lot of things, but he wasn't a fantasist. And he didn't seal those holes because he found nothing. He sealed them because he found something. Rebecca Chen looked at Hartwell, a silent question passing between them. Hartwell gave a tiny shake of his head, then turned back to Thomas with a different kind of smile. This one was all business, all edges. Mr. Mercer, let's speak plainly. You're out of options. The bank owns most of this land already. We're offering you a way out that lets you keep some dignity and a clean start. But if you prefer, we can wait for the foreclosure. Either way, we get the land. The only question is whether you walk away with something or nothing. What's buried there? Thomas asked. What did my grandfather find? Hartwell studied him for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. Rare earth elements, deposits worth roughly $400 million at current market prices. Your grandfather and the other families knew about it in the 60s, when nobody cared about rare earths. They could have sold out then, become wealthy beyond imagination. Instead, they formed a pact to leave it alone. The number hit Thomas like a physical blow. 400 million. Buried beneath land his family had worked for generations, never knowing they were sitting on a fortune. Why? Thomas asked. Why would they do that? Because they were fools, Hartwell said bluntly. They believed some nonsense about protecting the land, about keeping it in the hands of families who would care for it. They thought future generations would continue their legacy. But look around, Mr. Mercer. Where are those futures? The Henderson kids moved to California. Morrison's daughter is a lawyer in Chicago. The Zhang family's sons want nothing to do with farming. And you're about to sign away everything they tried to protect. Thomas felt the words like a knife between his ribs, mainly because they were true. He was the end of the line, the failure who couldn't hold on to what generations had built. We can extract those minerals, Hartwell continued, create hundreds of jobs, contribute to national technology industries that depend on rare earth elements, or we can let them sit in the ground while you lose everything to the bank. Your choice, but make it now. My patience has limits." Thomas looked down at the documents on the SUV hood. 9 signatures, $400 million worth of minerals he'd never benefit from. A legacy ending not with a bang, but with a signature on a dotted line. Then he thought about the woman from last night, about how she'd asked him to trust her, about that text message. "Don't sign anything." "I need to think about it," Thomas said. "You've had weeks to think about it," Price interjected, his hand moving toward his jacket. "Sign the papers." "Or what?" Thomas asked, hearing the steel in his own voice. "You'll shoot me? On my own property, in front of witnesses?" "Nobody's shooting anyone," Hartwell said smoothly, though his eyes promised otherwise. "But you should know that we found some interesting things in our title search. Irregularities in how your great-great-grandfather acquired this land in 1889 might make for a complicated legal situation if it were to come to light." "You're threatening to invalidate my family's claim to land we've worked for 135 years? I'm suggesting that signing these papers is the simplest solution for everyone." Hartwell checked his watch. "You have 5 minutes to decide." Thomas's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another message from E. Instead, it was a news alert. Federal investigation launched into Hartwell Agricultural Group's land acquisition practices. Whistleblower alleges fraud, coercion, and environmental crimes. The article's thumbnail showed a photo. The woman from last night, professional headshot, caption reading, "Dr. Elizabeth Navarro, former Hartwell Environmental Compliance Director." Thomas looked up at Hartwell and saw the exact moment the man realized what he was reading. The corporate mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "She went to the FBI," Thomas said quietly. "That's why you were looking for her. She's not confused or injured. She's a federal witness." Price's hand was fully inside his jacket now. Rebecca Chen had gone pale, backing away from the SUV. Hartwell just stood there, still as stone, weighing options. "This doesn't change anything," Hartwell finally said. "Whatever allegations she's making, they don't involve this property. Sign the papers." "No." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Thomas had said it before in his life, but never like this. Never with the weight of generations behind it, never with the certain knowledge that it might cost him everything. "You're making a mistake," Hartwell said softly. "Probably, but it's my mistake to make." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Hartwell nodded to his people, and they climbed back into their vehicles. But before he got in himself, Hartwell turned back to Thomas. "You think you've won something here? You haven't. That $400 million in the ground? It's worthless if you can't extract it. And you don't have the capital or the expertise. Your bank will foreclose in 30 days, and we'll buy the land from them. Same result, except now you get nothing, not even a clean conscience." The SUVs pulled away, leaving Thomas standing in his barnyard with unsigned documents scattered on the ground where Rebecca Chen had dropped them in her haste to leave. His phone rang, same unknown number from the text. "Mr. Mercer?" It was her. Elizabeth Navarro. "I'm sorry I got you involved in this. I didn't have anywhere else to go." "You're with the FBI now?" "In protective custody, yeah, but I needed someone to know the truth about what Hartwell's been doing. They've been using fraud and intimidation to acquire properties with rare earth deposits all across the Midwest. Your land, the Henderson property, Morrison's farm, they all sit on one of the largest undeveloped rare earth deposits in North America." "My grandfather knew," Thomas said. "They all knew, but they chose to leave it alone. Because mining rare earths is an environmental nightmare. The process contaminates groundwater, destroys topsoil, leaves the land poisoned for generations. Hartwell doesn't care. They've been doing it illegally on properties they've already acquired, hiding the environmental damage with shell companies and fake remediation reports. That's what I blew the whistle on." Thomas looked out across his fields, imagined them torn open, poisoned, dead. Everything his family had nurtured for 5 generations, reduced to a toxic wasteland in pursuit of profit. "What happens now?" he asked. The FBI is building their case, but it'll take months. In the meantime, Hartwell will do everything they can to acquire your property before the investigation becomes public. They need to complete the extraction and cover it up before anyone can stop them. She paused. You standing up to them today just painted a target on your back. So what am I supposed to do? I'm still broke. The bank's still calling in my loans. Hartwell was right. I'm going to lose this place either way. Maybe not. Elizabeth's voice changed, became more urgent. There's a provision in federal law. If land contains strategic minerals and a federal investigation is ongoing, the government can issue a temporary preservation order. It would freeze any transactions and give you time to explore other options. What other options? I can't mine it myself. But you could partner with companies that do ethical extraction. There are new technologies, ways to minimize environmental impact. It would take time, but it's possible. And with the value of those deposits, you'd have leverage to negotiate terms that actually benefit the community, not just corporate shareholders. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the morning sun on his face. His grandfather had sealed those boreholes 57 years ago, trusting that future generations would know what to do when the time came. Maybe this was that time. Maybe the choice wasn't between selling out or losing everything. Maybe there was a third option nobody had considered. How do I get one of these preservation orders? Thomas asked. I'll connect you with the FBI agent handling my case. But Thomas, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Hartwell plays for keeps. After the call ended, Thomas walked back out to the southwest corner of his property. The ground looked no different from any other section, just dirt and grass and the stubborn persistence of growing things. But underneath, invisible and patient, lay the future. Or maybe the past. Or maybe just a choice between two kinds of destruction. His phone buzzed one more time, a text from a number with a Washington area code. Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI. Dr. Navarro briefed me. Preservation order will be filed by end of business today. Suggest you find somewhere safe to stay until we can provide security. Hartwell's people don't take rejection well. Thomas looked back at his farmhouse, at the barn where 4 generations of Mercers had stored their equipment and their hopes. Somewhere safe. He'd lived here his whole life, survived droughts and debt and despair. The idea of leaving because some corporate executive made threats should have felt impossible. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. He went inside and packed a bag. Thomas spent the night at a roadside motel 40 miles from his farm, the kind of place that asked no questions and accepted cash. He lay awake listening to trucks rumble past on the interstate, thinking about his grandfather's hands. They'd been massive hands, scarred and calloused, capable of fixing a tractor engine or cradling a newborn calf with equal tenderness. Thomas remembered watching those hands write in journals, recording everything, preserving knowledge for a future he'd never see. His grandfather had known this moment would come, had written about it in passages Thomas hadn't understood until now. The land remembers, one entry from 1968 read, "We make our choices not for ourselves, but for people we'll never meet. That's what inheritance really means." At dawn, Thomas drove to a diner and ordered coffee he didn't drink. The television above the counter showed morning news, and halfway through his untouched eggs, the story appeared. Federal investigation expands. Hartwell Agricultural Group accused of environmental crimes across 6 states. The footage showed aerial shots of stripped land, contaminated water sources, and small towns devastated by industrial extraction. Elizabeth Navarro appeared on screen, professional and composed, explaining how Hartwell had systematically targeted struggling family farms, exploiting their desperation to acquire land with mineral deposits, then destroying it while falsifying environmental compliance reports. "These families trusted us," she said to the reporter. "They thought they were selling to a company that would honor their land. Instead, we poisoned it. I couldn't be part of that anymore." A farmer watching at the counter next to Thomas muttered, "Good for her." Then, recognizing Thomas's worn Carhartt jacket and work boots, added, "You farm?" "Used to," Thomas said, the words strange in his mouth. "Maybe still do, not sure yet." The farmer nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. Every farmer in America understood the feeling of holding on to something that was simultaneously everything and nothing, fighting a war that had been lost before they were born. Thomas's phone rang. Agent Webb. Mr. Mercer, the preservation order is filed. Your property's protected. But we've got a situation. Webb's voice carried a tension that made Thomas sit up straighter. Hartwell's lawyers are arguing that the order should only cover the mineral deposits themselves, not the surface land. They're claiming your bank debt is separate and foreclosure should proceed. Can they do that? Legally? It's complicated. The judge will decide. But in the meantime, I need you to return to your property. We're sending someone to document the rare earth deposits properly, establish their extent and strategic importance. The stronger our case that this is a critical national resource, the harder it'll be for Hartwell to argue around the order. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Hartwell's people know I'm the one who called you in. I'm aware. That's why we're sending federal protection. Should be there by 0900 hours. Webb paused. Mr. Mercer, what you did, standing up to them, it broke open their entire operation. We've got 3 other families willing to talk now, people who thought they were alone. You saved more than your own farm. The words should have brought comfort. Instead, Thomas just felt tired. He'd saved something maybe, but he'd also stepped into a fight that would define the rest of his life. The simple dream of passing his land to the next generation, that was gone. What replaced it was complicated and uncertain, and nothing like what his grandfather had envisioned. He drove back to his property as the morning sun climbed higher. The farm looked different somehow, though nothing physical had changed. The house still needed paint, the barn still leaned slightly south, the field still waited for planting, but knowing what lay beneath transformed it. Those 300 acres weren't just dirt and memories anymore. They were strategic assets, battlegrounds, symbols of something larger than one family's struggle. Thomas was walking the fence line when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in rural Nebraska. A sound he'd only heard in movies and air shows, jet engines, close and getting closer. The F-16 appeared over the eastern tree line, flying low enough that Thomas could see the pilot, could read the Air Force markings on its fuselage. It banked hard, circling his property once, twice, then lined up on his longest field, the eastern 40 acres where his grandfather had grown that golden wheat. Thomas stood frozen as the fighter jet touched down, impossibly loud, impossibly real. Dust and loose hay swirled in its wake as it taxied to a stop. The canopy opened and the pilot climbed out, followed by a second person in civilian clothes who'd been crammed into the back seat. The civilian jogged toward Thomas, stumbling slightly, clearly not used to arriving anywhere by fighter jet. He was older, maybe 60-70, with silver hair and the kind of face that had spent a lifetime solving complicated problems. "Thomas Mercer?" the man called out, extending his hand. "Dr. Richard Chen, Department of Defense. Sorry for the dramatic entrance. Your property's been designated as critical national infrastructure as of 0600 this morning. That's the fastest way we could get here." Thomas shook the offered hand, still processing the fact that there was a fighter jet parked in his wheat field. Critical national infrastructure? The rare earth deposits under your land. We've known about them since the 70s, actually. Your grandfather was part of a classified consultation back then. Government wanted to explore extraction for national defense purposes. He and the other families refused, said their land wasn't for sale at any price. Put it in writing, got some congressmen to bury the whole thing. Chen pulled out a tablet, showing Thomas decades-old documents. They made the government promise to leave it alone unless it became absolutely necessary. Thomas stared at his grandfather's signature on a document dated 1974, right below the signatures of Henderson and Morrison and Zhang. All those families, working together to protect something bigger than themselves. "It's necessary now?" Thomas asked. "Rare earth elements are critical for everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. China controls 90% of global supply, and they've started restricting exports. We need domestic sources, and your land contains one of the purest deposits we've ever found. Low contamination, high yield, accessible depth." Chen looked around at the farm with something like reverence. Your grandfather knew what he was sitting on. He chose farming over fortune because he understood something most people don't. Some things matter more than money. "He died broke," Thomas said quietly. My father died trying to save a farm that was already lost, and I've spent 20 years slowly drowning. What exactly did that choice protect? Chen was quiet for a moment, then pointed at the house. Can we go inside? There's more you need to know. In the kitchen where Thomas had grown up, where his grandfather had written his journals and his father had pored over failing ledgers, Dr. Chen spread out maps and technical documents. The rare earth deposits extended far beyond Thomas's property, under all the original homesteads, creating a network that the founding families had deliberately preserved. They didn't just refuse to mine it, Chen explained. They created a trust structure, legally binding across generations. Each family held part of the mineral rights, but none could be exploited without unanimous consent. It was brilliant, really. Made the whole thing worthless to corporations, unless they could acquire every single property. Which is what Hartwell's been doing, Thomas said, understanding clicking into place, buying the farms one by one. They have 47 of the original 53 properties. Your land, the Henderson place, and Morrison's old farm are the last holdouts. And because of the trust structure your grandfather set up, those 3 properties can veto any extraction on all 53. Chen smiled slightly. You don't just own 300 acres, Mr. Mercer. You're a gatekeeper to $400 million of strategic minerals. Thomas sat down heavily. The Hendersons sold to Hartwell months ago. Morrison's kids sold 2 years back. They sold the surface rights. Your grandfather was cleverer than that. The trust specifically separated surface from mineral rights. The families could sell their farms if they needed to, but the mineral rights stayed locked in the trust. Hartwell's been buying farms thinking they were getting everything, but the trust agreement means they can't touch what's underneath without consent from the trust's remaining stewards. Who are the remaining stewards? Chen checked his tablet. As of this morning, you and James Miller. He's Henderson's grandson, inherited his portion through his mother's line. Lives in Cleveland now, works for NASA. We've already contacted him. He's on his way here. The morning spiraled into something surreal after that. More officials arrived by helicopter this time, FBI agents, Justice Department lawyers, someone from the Department of Agriculture. They set up command posts in Thomas's barn, turning his failed farm into something that looked like a military operation. Agent Webb showed up around noon, bringing Elizabeth Navarro with him. She looked different in daylight, younger than Thomas had thought, more vulnerable. She approached him carefully, like someone approaching an animal that might bolt. I owe you an apology, she said. I put you in danger. If I'd known about the trust structure, about what your property really represented, I would have what? Thomas interrupted. Still needed somewhere to hide. Still needed someone to trust. He surprised himself by smiling. I'm glad it was me. Glad I did something that mattered for once. She studied his face. You've been doing things that matter your whole life. You just couldn't see it, because the world made you think keeping land was the same as failing to profit from it. A black sedan pulled up around 2 in the afternoon, and a man climbed out who Thomas recognized from old photographs. Same eyes as Pete Henderson, same build as Morrison, but dressed in a suit that spoke of different choices, different paths. James Miller crossed the barnyard with the careful steps of someone returning to a place that held too many memories. Thomas, he said, gripping Thomas's hand firmly. My dad used to bring me here when I was a kid. Your grandfather let me ride on his tractor. They walked the property together, 2 men carrying the weight of decisions made by people now dead. James explained how he'd spent years in aerospace engineering, helping design satellites and defense systems, never knowing he held a key to the very materials those systems required. Dad tried to tell me before he died, James said as they stood at the southwest corner, looking at ground that appeared ordinary but contained extraordinary things. Said I had a responsibility to the land, to the trust. I thought he was just being sentimental. A dying man's nostalgia. He laughed bitterly. I sold his farm without understanding what I was really giving up. But not the mineral rights, Thomas reminded him. Not the mineral rights, James agreed. So now what? We're sitting on a fortune, but we can't touch it without destroying everything our families tried to protect. Dr. Chen joined them, having clearly been waiting for this moment. What if I told you we've developed new extraction methods, low-impact processes that could recover the rare earths without the environmental devastation? It would take longer, cost more, but it's possible. Who's we? James asked. Defense Department Research Division. We've been working on this for 5 years, knowing we'd eventually need domestic sources. The technology's ready. We just need the deposits. Chen looked between them. But here's the critical part. The trust your grandfathers created gives you more than veto power. It gives you negotiation power. You can set terms, environmental protections, community benefits, limits on extraction rates. You could make this happen the right way. Thomas felt dizzy. 24 hours ago, he'd been signing away his legacy. Now he was being offered a chance to reshape it into something his grandfather might have actually approved of. What about Hartwell? They still own most of the surface land. Hartwell's done, Agent Webb said, approaching with a grim satisfaction. We executed search warrants this morning at all their facilities. The environmental crimes alone will put their executives away for years. Their assets will be frozen, possibly seized. Those properties they bought, they'll be tied up in legal proceedings for the foreseeable future, Elizabeth added. And there's precedent for invalidating contracts obtained through fraud. Some of those families might be able to buy their land back. The sun was setting by the time the officials finished their business and departed, leaving Thomas and James standing in the barnyard. The fighter jet had left hours ago, replaced by the normal sounds of evening. Crickets, wind through wheat, the distant call of a hawk. I can't come back here, James said quietly. My life's in Cleveland. My kids have never set foot on a farm. But I don't want to sell, not really. I just don't know what else to do. Thomas looked at his farmhouse, at the field stretching to the horizon. What if we did something different? What if we turned this into something that could support both our families and others? Use the mineral revenues to build something sustainable. They talked into the night, sketching out ideas that would have seemed impossible a day ago. A cooperative structure that would allow the original families to return if they wanted, that would train new farmers in sustainable practices, that would use the wealth buried in the ground to support the life growing on top of it. It was complicated and idealistic and probably doomed to be harder than either of them imagined. But it was possible. 3 weeks later, Thomas stood in his field watching the first bore samples being taken. The equipment was smaller than he'd expected, less invasive. Dr. Chen had been true to his word. The extraction process looked nothing like the devastation Hartwell had left in their wake. This was surgical, careful, guided by people who understood that what came out of the ground mattered less than what remained. Sarah had come home from college, bringing friends from her agricultural science program. They walked the fields with tablets and soil testing kits, designing crop rotations that would work around the extraction sites. She'd looked at her father with new eyes, seeing him not as a failed farmer but as a man who'd refused to fail in the ways that mattered most. Dad, she'd said on her first night back, my professor asked me to write about what happened here. The whole story. Grandpa's trust, Hartwell's fraud, the preservation order. She thinks it could change how we think about land rights and mineral extraction. Thomas had nodded, thinking about his grandfather's journals. Then, write it. Make sure people understand that this wasn't luck. It was choice. Every generation making the hard choice, even when it looked like failure. Now, watching the sun set over land that had survived another day, another crisis, another attempt to reduce it to mere commodity, Thomas finally understood what his grandfather had been protecting. Not just minerals or property values or even environmental integrity, though those mattered. He'd been protecting the right to choose, the freedom to say that some things weren't for sale at any price, that legacy meant more than profit, that the land could be partner instead of possession. His phone buzzed. A message from James. Trust agreement revised and filed. We're official. Our grandparents would be proud. Thomas typed back, they already are. In the distance, he could see lights from the Henderson property, where a young family, environmental scientists from Minneapolis, had moved in after Hartwell's assets were seized and the property sold in bankruptcy proceedings. They'd brought their kids, who ran through fields that had been empty for 2 years. Laughter carried on the wind, the sound of renewal. Morrison's old farm had been purchased by a nonprofit focusing on sustainable agriculture. They were turning it into an educational center where students could learn traditional farming methods alongside cutting-edge environmental science. The valley was coming back to life, but different now, changed by crisis, shaped by choices made in moments when the easy path had been clearly marked but ultimately rejected. Thomas walked to the northwest corner where the original homestead cabin had stood. The stone foundation was still there, grass-covered but permanent. He knelt and placed his hand on stones that his great-great-grandfather had laid in 1889, stones that had outlasted empires and economies and the men who'd placed them. "The land remembers," his grandfather had written. "We make our choices not for ourselves, but for people we'll never meet." Thomas finally understood. The choice wasn't between selling or losing, between profit or poverty, between past or future. The choice was whether to believe that the land had value beyond what could be extracted from it, whether to trust that doing the right thing would matter even if you never saw the results. He thought about the woman stumbling into his headlights, about the documents unsigned, about the F-16 landing in his wheat field. A week of moments that had changed everything, that had transformed failure into something that looked like purpose. Standing, Thomas looked across acres that were simultaneously burden and blessing, legacy and future, problem and solution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, negotiations with government contractors, meetings with environmental groups, decisions about how to share wealth that his family had preserved by refusing to pursue it. But tonight, the land was quiet. The soil smelled rich after recent rain. The stars emerged one by one, the same stars his grandfather had watched, making the same silent promise that what you protect today might save someone tomorrow. Thomas walked back to his house as darkness settled fully. Inside, his grandfather's journals waited, full of wisdom he was only beginning to understand. Outside, the land waited too, patient as always, holding its secrets and its promises with equal care. He'd come so close to signing it all away, so close to becoming the generation that broke the chain, that failed where others had persevered. But he hadn't. In the moment when everything hung in balance, he'd chosen to trust in a stranger's warning, in his grandfather's legacy, in the possibility that some battles were worth fighting even when they looked unwinnable. The land had rewarded that trust. Or maybe the land had simply been waiting, the way it always waited, for someone to make the choice that needed making. Either way, the Mercer family farm would see another sunrise, and another generation would have the chance to make their own choices, to decide what mattered and what didn't, to learn that the most valuable things are often the ones you refuse to sell. Thomas turned off the lights and stood at his window, watching the darkness settle over fields that had survived another day, another crisis, another test. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, for the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Simple and profound as good soil after rain. 6 months passed like seasons always do on a farm, measured not in days but in the work that filled them. The extraction operations began in late spring, careful and methodical, nothing like the industrial violence Hartwell had inflicted elsewhere. Thomas watched the first samples emerge from deep earth, minerals that had waited beneath his family's field since before humanity had words for what they were. The money came in stages, managed through the trust structure that James Miller had modernized with the help of lawyers who actually understood what they were protecting. It wasn't the instant fortune that Hartwell had dangled like bait. It was slower, steadier, the kind of wealth that could sustain rather than corrupt. Enough to pay off the bank, to repair equipment, to plant crops that had a chance of actually making it to harvest. But more than that, it was enough to bring people home. The Henderson property's new family, the Kellers, had become friends, their kids crossing the old boundary line like it had never existed. Maria Keller was a soil scientist who looked at Thomas's exhausted fields and saw a possibility instead of failure. She'd spent weeks teaching him and Sarah about regenerative practices, methods that worked with the land rather than against it. "Your grandfather was doing some of this already," Maria had said one afternoon, showing Thomas notations in the old journals. "He just didn't have the language for it. But look, crop rotations designed to restore nitrogen, planned fallow periods, native species integration. He understood the land needed to rest, to heal, to be something more than a factory." Thomas had read those passages a dozen times before without seeing what she saw. His whole life, he'd thought he was following in failure's footsteps, maintaining methods that couldn't compete. He hadn't understood he'd been practicing conservation before it had a trendy name, protecting something while the world around him chose extraction. The Morrison Properties Educational Center opened in August, drawing students from 3 states. Sarah had deferred her fall semester to help coordinate programs, her agricultural science coursework suddenly feeling less theoretical and more like coming home to work she was meant to do. Thomas watched her lead tours through fields where sustainable extraction coexisted with productive farming, explaining to wide-eyed college students how it was possible to take from the earth without destroying it. "My great-great-great-grandfather broke this land," she told them during one tour Thomas overheard, "turned prairie into farmland, which was its own kind of violence. But then every generation after tried to heal what had been broken, even when they didn't know that's what they were doing, even when the world told them they were failing." She'd glanced at Thomas when she said it, and he'd felt something shift in his chest. Not pride exactly, though there was that. Something bigger. The recognition that the story didn't end with him. That failure and success were just words people used when they didn't understand that the real measure was whether you left the land better than you found it, or at least gave it a fighting chance. James Miller visited in September, bringing his teenage daughter Rebecca. She'd been skeptical about the trip, the kind of 15-year-old skepticism that came from growing up in suburbs where food appeared in grocery stores without thought of where it originated. But Thomas watched her face change as James showed her the stone foundation of the original homestead, as he told her stories about her great-grandfather Henderson and the choice he'd made to protect rather than profit. "All those years," James said quietly, kneeling by the stones, "I thought Dad was just stubborn, holding on to something that had no value because he couldn't accept the world had moved on, but he was holding the line. They all were." Rebecca had touched the stones with something like reverence. "What happens when we're gone? Who holds the line then?" James looked at Thomas, and Thomas looked at Sarah standing with the Keller kids in a field of wheat that was actually growing, actually thriving. "Someone always does," Thomas said, "if we show them why it matters." The trust had expanded by October. 3 of the families who'd sold to Hartwell, whose contracts were invalidated after the fraud prosecution, had bought their land back. Not all of them planned to farm it themselves. The Lee family from California sent their son David to manage their restored property while they finished careers in Silicon Valley. The Robinsons were retiring to their reclaimed acres after 30 years in Chicago. The Petersons remained in Boston, but put the land in a conservation easement and hired local farmers to work it under cooperative terms. Each property added its own character to what was becoming something unprecedented. A patchwork of small holdings united by shared mineral rights and shared values, proving that economy of scale wasn't the only way to make agriculture work. They called it the Valley Trust, and it became something that researchers and policymakers visited to study, trying to understand how it succeeded where conventional wisdom said it should fail. Thomas found himself in meetings he'd never imagined attending. Congressional hearings about mineral rights and agricultural policy, interviews with farming journals, conversations with documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell the story. He was uncomfortable with the attention, preferred the simple work of planting and harvesting to explaining himself to people in suits who'd never touched soil. But Elizabeth Navarro, who'd become a consultant for the trust once the Hartwell prosecution concluded, convinced him the visibility mattered. "You're proof that there's another way," she said. "Every farmer who sees what you've built here, every family thinking about selling to the next Hartwell, they need to know they have choices." By November, the valley looked different, not just physically, though the new equipment and restored buildings certainly marked the change. It was something less tangible, a sense that the land had exhaled after holding its breath for decades. Lights appeared in farmhouses that had stood dark. Children's voices carried across fields where silence had reigned. The weekly farmers market in town, which had been down to 3 vendors, now needed a larger space. The corporate farms surrounding the valley still loomed on the horizon, their massive operations unchanged, but they no longer felt inevitable. They were just one choice among many, no longer the only possible future. Thomas stood in his field on Thanksgiving morning, watching Sarah and the Keller kids prepare the community dinner in the barn. 20 families would gather today, including James Miller and his daughter who'd flown in from Cleveland. The old barn, where Thomas had once contemplated auctioning off equipment piece by piece, now held tables and decorations and the kind of abundance that came from people sharing what they had instead of hoarding against scarcity. His phone had stopped ringing with threats months ago. The unknown numbers now were usually reporters or researchers, easily ignored. Hartwell's executives were in prison or fighting legal battles that would occupy them for years. David Hartwell himself, once untouchable and confident, had been sentenced to 15 years for environmental crimes and fraud. His empire was being dismantled piece by piece, assets seized and redistributed. Justice had a weight Thomas felt but couldn't quite articulate. It didn't undo the years of struggle, didn't bring back his father or grandfather to see what their choices had protected. But it meant something. It meant that doing the right thing, even when it looked like losing, could matter in ways you'd never see coming. As evening approached and the community gathered, Thomas found himself studying faces. Maria Keller discussing soil composition with Sarah. James Miller showing his daughter the old tractor Thomas's grandfather had restored. Elizabeth Navarro talking with David Lee about expanding the trust to include water rights protection. Children running between tables, too young to understand the history that had brought them here, just happy to have space to run. This was what his grandfather had protected. Not minerals or property values, but this. The possibility of people living in connection with land that remembered them, that would outlast them, that linked generations in ways stock portfolios never could. The dinner was loud and chaotic and perfect. Stories got told and retold, embellished with each iteration. The night his tractor struck metal that wasn't metal. The storm, when Elizabeth appeared like a ghost. The F-16 landing in his wheat field, which had already become legend among the Valley families. The moment Thomas refused to sign, standing in his barnyard with everything to lose and nothing but stubborn hope to sustain him. "You're a hero," someone's teenager told him as the evening wound down, the kind of earnest proclamation only the young can make without irony. Thomas shook his head. "I'm just a farmer who got lucky. Wrong place, right time." "That's not what my dad says." The kid pointed to where David Lee stood with his father on a video call, showing him the restored fields. "He says you reminded people that giving up isn't the only option, that sometimes you hold on, even when it looks stupid." After everyone left, after Sarah and the Kellers finished cleaning up and went home, Thomas walked his land one more time. It was a habit now, this nightly circuit, checking on things that didn't really need checking. The extraction equipment sat silent in the southwest corner, a necessary intrusion he'd made peace with. The fields held stubble from harvest, resting until spring. The house lights glowed warm against November darkness. He ended up at the stone foundation, as he often did. The Henderson cabin site that had become something of a shrine, a reminder of where everything started. Someone, probably Sarah, had placed a small weatherproof plaque there. In memory of the families who chose to hold the line. May their choice echo through generations. Thomas knelt and touched the stones, feeling their cold permanence. His grandfather's hands had touched these same stones, and his father's and his great-grandfather's. Now his hand, scarred from a lifetime of farming, joined that history. Someday Sarah's hands would touch them too, and maybe her children's hands, carrying forward a story that had been written in soil and sacrifice and the stubborn refusal to believe that everything had a price. The stars emerged, same ones his grandfather had watched, same patterns that had guided farmers for millennia. The land stretched around him, familiar and strange at once, scarred but healing, changed but enduring, simultaneously his burden and his inheritance. Tomorrow would bring its own work. Meetings about expanding the trust, decisions about next season's planting, the endless negotiation between what the land needed and what could be extracted from it. But tonight, standing in darkness that felt more welcoming than empty, Thomas finally understood what all the struggle had been for. Not success in any conventional sense, not wealth or recognition or even security. It was for this moment, this feeling of being connected to something larger than himself, connected to every generation that had worked this land and every generation that might work it after he was gone. Connected to a place that knew his footsteps, that held his family's history in layers of soil and stone and memory. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of earth and distant snow. Winter was coming, as it always did, followed by spring, followed by summer's heat and autumn's harvest. The cycle continued, indifferent to human drama, marking time in ways that made individual lives feel small. But those small lives mattered. Each choice, each moment of resistance or surrender, each decision to hold on or let go. They accumulated like sediment, becoming the foundation future generations would build upon. His grandfather had understood that, had made his choices knowing he'd never see their ultimate result, trusting that someone would come after him who understood what he'd been protecting. Thomas had almost failed that trust, had come so close to becoming the generation that broke the chain, that chose immediate relief over long-term preservation. But he hadn't. In the moment when everything hung in balance, he'd made the right choice. Not because he was heroic or visionary, but because a stranger had asked him to trust her, and something in his grandfather's journals had whispered that some things were worth more than profit. The land had rewarded that trust. Or maybe it had simply been waiting, patient as stone, certain as seasons, for someone to make the choice that needed making. Walking back to his house, Thomas felt the weight of it all settle on his shoulders. Not burden exactly, though there was that. Something more like responsibility embraced rather than resented. He was a link in a chain that stretched backward into history and forward into a future he'd never see. That chain had held because people made it hold, generation after generation, choosing continuation over convenience. Inside, he found his grandfather's journal open on the table. Sarah must have been reading it earlier. The page showed an entry from 1975. Today, I explained to young Thomas why we farm. Not for money, though we need that. Not for food, though we provide that. We farm because someone has to remember that the land is not property, it's a partner. It remembers us long after we're forgotten. Our job is to make sure it has good memories. Thomas had been 5 years old in 1975, too young to remember that conversation, but reading it now, he felt his grandfather's presence, as surely as he felt the floorboards beneath his feet. The old man had known this moment would come, had prepared for it in ways Thomas was only beginning to understand. Closing the journal, Thomas turned off the lights and stood at his window one last time. The valley darkness was complete now, punctuated only by distant farmhouse lights, small, defiant points of illumination holding back the night. Each light represented a family that had chosen to stay, to fight, to believe that there was value in being rooted to a place that knew your name. Tomorrow, the work would continue. The extraction operations, the cooperative harvests, the endless meetings and decisions that came with trying to build something unprecedented. But tonight, standing in his grandfather's house on his grandfather's land, Thomas felt something he'd spent most of his adult life chasing. Peace. Not the peace of having no struggles, but the peace of knowing the struggles mattered, that the work he did today would ripple forward through time, affecting people he'd never meet in ways he couldn't predict. The land would remember. That was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.